You're watching Kansas City Television live. This is KCTV 5 News at 9.
Well, it's not the same as it once was. Coming up next, we're going to talk about the history of hitchhiking. That's with historian Raffi Andonian. That's when we come back.
If you look up the definition of hitchhiking, you'll find a bunch of variations of basically the same concept. Hold out your thumb on the side of the road if you're looking for a free ride, right?
It's kind of a pretty negative connotation that goes along with hitchhiking nowadays, but climbing into a stranger's car hasn't been always such a gamble. So July, believe it or not, is National Hitchhiking Month. Here to tell us more about the history of hitchhiking is celebrity historian Raffi Andonian. I want to thank you for being here again this morning, sir. We talked about sewing machines with you last time you were here.
That's right.
So,
we're talking about thumbing, as it's known.
Yeah. I'm excited to talk a little bit about hitchhiking, though. Let's start with the basics. When did hitchhiking become kind of like a regular, popular thing in the U.S.? And before you answer, can I just take a guess? Because I'm going to guess like the 60s.
No, that's actually on the tail end of when it was popular. Yeah.
Okay.
So hitchhiking has its origins actually even before the car. There were people hitchhiking, you know, on wagons and horses. But the way we think of it in a car is the 1920s is when it really starts to spike. Because think about it, in the 20s there's this, the roaring 20s, right? The it girl, the material stuff. The car is this, you know, fancy technology. So it's this sort of adventure to do in the 20s. But it changes over time, much like anything else in history. So in the 30s, for example, when you hit the Great Depression, now is a thing of necessity. So, you know, you're out of a job and maybe you're trying to change cities or go down the road or even move. Hitchhiking was seen as something that you might do, you know, sort of to help out someone in need. And then in World War II, it changes again because you have a gasoline shortage, you have a tire, not shortage, but the rationing of the gasoline and tires. And so now it's seen as a civic duty to share cars, not to be driving as one person at a time. So it's always constantly changing. You also had soldiers that might be trying to get home from bases and such. So what you're talking about really has its roots in the 50s. So by the time you get to the 50s, you have Jack Kerouac, On the Road, the Beats. There's this sort of suburban comfort, and they want to get out of that to do more adventure, out of the suburbs, to see a cross-section of society. And so you get to the 60s, it evolves to the counterculture, trying to say, we're going to do something different that was no longer kind of looked actually very positively outside of the counterculture. So there were actually some laws against hitchhiking, for example, by the time you get to the 60s. So it's kind of seen as a rebellious thing to do.
I don't know about this, but my mother used to, they called it hitch. They used to hitch.
I've heard thumbing.
So,
that's what I've heard.
Okay.
And did you know you're supposed to point your thumb in the direction that you're going?
That you want to go? That makes sense.
I didn't realize that until recently, so I'm glad I wasn't like going the wrong way when I was hitchhiking.
Find yourself going backwards,
In present day, I don't think most people are considering hitchhiking. I know I probably wouldn't, but when do you think that changed, when it became it's not something we're going to do anymore?
It's over the course of time. I would say, one, you have it kind of illegal at some point, right? Although people would still do it in the counterculture. But I would say really in the 1980s is when you kind of solidify that it really starts to move away. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is sort of the individualism in the 1980s, a little bit different attitude than you have in the 60s. So that's part of it. I think also more and more crime stories about, you know, hitchhiking. That affects things as well. Funny enough, speaking of the 80s, though, Ronald Reagan was actually a hitchhiker at some point early in his life. Yeah. Think about it. He was born in the, you know, almost 80 years prior. So, you know, he's kind of in that era. So you think about sort of the historical origins, but these things change over time. But I would say the 80s, between the stories and the individualism, is how you have this change away from hitchhiking.
Let's talk a little bit about the stories maybe behind it, because when I think about like stories and hitchhiking in film, I think about Field of Dreams, because, you know, James Earl Jones and what's his name? I just lost it. Because Kevin Costner, they're going back to Iowa and they pick up the ball player who turns out to be the doctor. Spoiler alert. But, you know, and it's romanticized in that way, you know. But then also there's other films where it's not so much of a romanticization, more of a horror story. You know, you pick up the wrong hitchhiker, right? So what are some of the stories that you've kind of heard told throughout the years of hitchhiking?
Yeah, well, you know what's funny about that is I would say the theme, though, to that is freedom, right? There's this notion of freedom and getting on the road. My favorite story for hitchhiking is very famous, of course, Jack Kerouac, On the Road. To me, there's a scene where he's sitting there with a truck driver. I just think it's so fascinating, the way that he's getting exposed to that. He's getting exposed to a different social class than he otherwise would. So if it were me, if I were going to go to a hitchhiking story, I would start with a classic, with Jack Kerouac, On the Road, direct primary source. That's what made it really popular in the subsequent decade, from the late 50s into the 60s. So I'd go there historically to get some great stories.
I love it. All right, would you say that it is safe today? Is it something that we should be doing today?
Oh, gosh, I would be careful.
World.
I would be careful, you know. Yeah. But I would say, you know, Uber and Lyft are a form of hitchhiking.
I agree. I was going to bring that up because
it depends on the context.
I think if you, and I don't know about you, I imagine you are too, but I'm a talker. And so if I'm getting an Uber or wherever, I always love, specifically if I'm traveling, I always love if they are native and they can share, you know, just anything about their story. And I feel like it's a similar situation, maybe a little safer.
It is. Yeah, I would say it is safer than, you know, randomly hitchhiking with a thumb on the road.
Right.
But I do think that, you know, what that shows is, you know, elements of historical kind of roots still live with us today, right? History doesn't just disappear. It's around us in the present.
Still there,
and it helps shape our perceptions. And we have these sort of different, you know, barriers of what we consider safe, as they did back then. You know, the 30s and the 60s were different eras, and the 60s and the 2020s are different eras. So they're going to have different sort of cultural understandings of where that safety barrier is. Today, with technology and trusting the company to have some kind of background, you know, we say, okay, in this situation it's safe, but in that situation maybe we don't find it safe.
All right, celebrity historian Raffi Andonian, thank you for being here and come back again. Thank you for
we love the stories.
I always appreciate it.
Little toy cars I brought from my childhood that I thought would be perfectly fitting.
That is very fitting. Thanks
very
again
fitting.
for being here, man.
Thank
Hope you're back here again soon.